Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of the Unlock the Sugar Shackles podcast. I am coming out of my skin. I am so excited about this interview with my guest today, Stephen Hussey. I never thought I could be so intrigued by the heart and heart disease. I also, I'm going to be honest, I'm not like super interested in stuff about heart disease, which is a weird thing to say because basically everyone in my dad's side of the family and the Durante family, they all have heart disease. They have high blood pressure, high cholesterol. My grandpa and an uncle just had a quadruple bypass, many heart attacks in like the extended family on my grandma's side. I mean, heart disease runs rampant in my family and is unfortunately still the number one killer of women and of our entire population. So heart disease is not something that we should be overlooking, but the current model of like chasing cholesterol, demonizing cholesterol is just, as many of you know, is just not the answer. But in the old paradigm, in like, keeping carbs low and all those things, we're getting closer. However, my guest today, Stephen, will tell you that that's not enough either. We have to take into account this whole piece of light, magnetism, grounding, all those type of things, our circadian rhythm, and these quantum strategies to optimize our health, because if we don't take those into account, we're missing a huge piece of the picture. And also those strategies allow us, as you'll learn, to actually prevent and start reversing signs of heart disease. So I felt so excited walking away from this interview because I felt so, I just feel so much more of my own health, and also it, having a ton of heart disease in the family is nerve-wracking, right? But I feel even optimistic for someone like my dad who already has, some stuff going on, that even he is going to be able to reverse those things and not have issues like the rest of his brothers and the family. So, my dad was telling me, he's like, you'll be happy. This morning I was using my red light over my heart and I sat outside and I put my feet on the ground. I'm like, oh my God. So I was freaking out. I'm so excited. And so I really think you're going to enjoy this interview with Stephen Hussey. So I left his website, his Instagram, his socials, his bio, everything is in the show notes. So please check him out. But first, do yourself a favor, listen to this entire interview. You are going to be, I think, so excited and lit up by this information. So let's dive in. Hey, Stephen, welcome back to the podcast, to the Light Up Your Metabolism podcast. The name has changed since you've been here last, and lots has changed, but I'm excited to have you back.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. This should be fun.
Yeah. So lots have changed for both of us since we recorded the first time on the podcast. And I remember seeing your work back in the day and seeing how interested you were in the heart because, as a person with type 1 diabetes, there's a higher incidence of heart issues, which I didn't know at the time. And so a lot has changed for you since that time as well. So why don't we dive into, your health history and journey, and then maybe how you sort of came upon some new strategies that I've also been diving into, some of these quantum and circadian strategies.
For sure. So just kind of a brief overview, like me, and I mean, it's just like any health, anybody interested in health, it kind of is inspired by their, personal health journey. We're kind of forced into this world, but yeah, at a very young age, I had a lot of, health conditions, I guess, or just health struggles. From the age of 2, I had like asthma and terrible allergies, and I had IBS and just lots of inflammatory things. I used to break out in hives all over my body, and they really couldn't tell me why. Ended up with autoimmune. That's the theory. It's autoimmune type 1 diabetes at age 9. And my parents and I were just kind of thrown into the world of Western medicine. Like, how do we manage these conditions? And that's the key word, is manage. No solutions, no explanation of why they're there or anything like that. But it wasn't until I grew up in college, like probably the second half of college, I started changing the way I live my life. And there was a direct impact on my ability to manage these conditions, and I got rid of most of them. Aside from the type 1 diabetes, that was kind of collateral damage from that inflammation. So I found it interesting that no doctor ever told me that you could do that. And that kind of, spurred my interest into health and what else could I learn? What else had they not told me? That kind of thing. And as a type 1 diabetic, I was heavily predisposed to heart disease. So I always kind of focused on that. Even though I learned as much as I could about everything, I was always more interested in heart disease. And so, throughout my formal education as a chiropractor and functional medicine practitioner, I always tried to learn as much as I could about heart disease. Though looking back at those formal educations, they gave me a good baseline education of what we think we know about the body. But that was pretty much it. It really didn't give me any explanations. And I thought that's why I got a master's in functional medicine too, because I was just like, well, that wasn't what the answer was, getting that education. So let's try something else. And then I realized, okay, it's not informal education. It's not going to get it. Right. And so, lots of trial and error, lots of, different health strategies I tried over the years, always reading new things and all that kind of stuff. And then despite my best efforts, in 2021, January 2021, I had a heart attack, a pretty significant heart attack, the one they call the Widowmaker. And so, leading up to that, there was a lot of stress. I'm heavily predisposed as a type 1 diabetic. People probably interested, to know that my CAC score was 0 6 months prior to that, which doesn't measure soft plaque. But when they went in to place the stent, when they did the angiogram and the heart cath to place the stent, they found no soft plaque anywhere, just a giant clot that formed in the left anterior descending artery. So there wasn't even any soft plaque. And so that caught me by surprise. I was obviously quite demoralized when that happened. Sitting there in the hospital, just wondering why. And, when I asked them in the hospital, because at this point I was just like, hands up, like, okay, what do you guys got? Like, tell me, what do you think caused this? The answer was always the same. It's your cholesterol. The cholesterol causes heart attacks. And I was sitting there. I didn't have all the information at the time. Like, I didn't know that there was no soft plaque. I was just, just there in the hospital the day after. And so I couldn't really challenge them that much. But, from my previous, research, I knew that is a very short-sighted, very myopic view of what causes this full-blown disease process. And so I was just like, but every new attending that came in, I would ask that question. It was always that. It was always your cholesterol's high. And I knew that my cholesterol was quote unquote high, if you want to call it that. And I knew that because of work of Dave Feldman, and, I'm a lean mass hyperresponder, and that I was eating a low carb diet, which made blood sugars really hard to control. And at times I was on a carnivore diet, and that, was the only thing that ever fixed my gut issues. So a lot of that stuff. And so, but I rejected that paradigm of cholesterol causes heart disease. And, that was the only answer they were giving me. However, I came across a quote of Thomas Kuhn, who says that to reject one paradigm without simultaneously replacing it with another is to reject science itself. And so I had rejected that paradigm and hadn't replaced it with something else. Like, what does cause heart disease? It's not LDL. And I still very much sort of like believe that. And there's plenty of evidence for that. But what does? And what causes heart disease? What causes heart attacks? What causes this? And that's what I dove into after this. And that led me to this world of light and circadian rhythm and, energy and these types of things, and structured water, even more than I knew about it before. And that led me on this other path. And the story gets even better from there, because after the heart attack, my heart was a little bit damaged, and my ejection fraction was low, and the signal of conduction through my heart had decreased. And then the other thing was that about 2 months later, I started becoming more active again. And I realized that I couldn't even really walk fast without pain in my lower right leg. And I was like, what's going on? It was a deep vein thrombosis. Is this compartment syndrome? What is this? And eventually found out that I developed atherosclerosis in the lower part of my thigh, in that spot, because they went into that artery in my leg, in my groin, to place the stent when I had the heart attack. And they used this device called AngioSeal that seals it up afterwards. And that interrupted the blood flow from the from my into my leg, and it kind of pulled up in that area in my lower right thigh, which is the most common place to get atherosclerosis in your leg. And I developed atherosclerosis, so I wasn't getting blood flow to my lower leg very well. But it only was really a problem if I exerted myself, right? So it's an issue, right? It was, and then so we did the ultrasound, and it was 75 to 99% blocked in that area. So I couldn't even walk fast to the airport. Definitely couldn't run, couldn't play soccer, couldn't snowboard, couldn't do anything like that. And so at the time they were like, well, it's not interfering with your day-to-day life. You just can't do some of the things you like to do. So we're just going to leave it alone, because if we mess with it, usually they get worse. And I was like, okay. But at that time I was getting into this type of stuff. And so, I started the things that I changed was, I took, 2 supplements that were different. One was serapeptase, and one was, like an L-arginine taurine type supplement. But the main things that I did was I started getting way more sunlight. I started grounding a ton. I optimized my circadian rhythm, and I bought an infrared sauna and started using the sauna like pretty much every day. And a year later, after that first test, that showed a 75 to 99% blockage, it was only 50% blocked. And at that time, the vascular surgeon said, well, we can't say it's better because these things don't get better. We just don't see these things get better. That's what he said. And it was funny too, because the technician who did the test, she came back in and said, the doctor wants me to retest it and just see, because that's a weird response. And they retested it, and it was the same thing. It was only 50% blocked, so it had gotten better. And then a year after that, the other follow-up, it was normal, completely normal. My artery, there was no stenosis in it whatsoever. And then a year after that, the second follow-up, which was just this past May, it's still normal. And I thought, I was pretty sure that it would be normal, because I was able to play soccer, like pick up soccer, like in February, and I got the test in May, that first time it was normal. So I was like, okay, it's probably at least better, but it was normal. And so it just goes to show the power of these things, And so the thing that I want people to understand is, well, we can go into the mechanisms of why I think that happened. But the thing I want people to understand is that my stress, unfortunately, probably stayed about the same or got worse after the heart attack. My diet stayed the same. It was still low carb. My LDL was still high. I only took one of the medications they recommended for 6 months, and that was a blood thinner. And then I stopped taking that. And my LDL and my total cholesterol was quite elevated according to their standards. So my LDL, which is supposed to be quote unquote lower than 100, was always over 200, and at times over 370. And during those 2 years that I reversed atherosclerosis, my LDL was high. So there's something wrong with that theory, and that right there shows it. And it's an N of 1 experiment. You can just say that it's one person's example, but it should warrant investigation. And it's just baffling to me that the vascular surgeon wasn't like, well, what have you been doing? He said, we don't see this ever. And then you just saw it, and there was no follow-up like, well, what have you done anything? Like, how did this happen? Like, trying to figure that out so we could help other people. There was just nothing. It was just like, well, lucky you. All right, cool. I don't have to see you anymore.
That's the most disappointing part. And I hear that constantly. My clients go in and they're like, telling their doctor is like, oh, my doctor's so happy that I reversed my type 2 diabetes, then I don't have hypoglycemia anymore, and I was coming in here for years with that. And I'm like, oh, did they ask you how you did it? And they're like, no, she didn't really care, or whatever it is. And it's just, that to me makes the whole thing worse, because it's like these doctors, it's hard not to feel really disillusioned. But that story is so incredible, your story of healing. It is, by the way, raining, so if you're hearing that, I'm outside because I feel better outside, and because of all these things that we're talking about. But I too, I didn't have a health issue that made me change what I was doing, but I've also gone down this road because it's just what I was teaching about blood sugar regulation. It just felt incomplete without this new information, which now grounds it literally, and puts it's giving it context, it's giving it timing, and it's giving it a lot of missing factors that are directing the biochemistry of what to do. And so I always say I wish I had found this earlier, and I'm sure you do too. We all do. But I'm so happy that it it came across, my Instagram feed, and I started learning these things. And so I'm so glad you did too, because the fact that you were able to heal something that was, according to, centralized science, irreversible, I mean, that's pretty powerful. So let's talk about like atherosclerosis, hard word to say. So what is like the centralized mainstream medicine saying versus what you now believe?
Yeah. So the mainstream for years has been saying that it's cholesterol building up in arteries, developing plaques, slowly narrowing an artery, right? So we have higher cholesterol levels. It's more likely that this, accumulates in the lining of the artery, and then we get this stenosis or plaque formation. And there's varying theories, but it's very interesting. There's a study, or not a study, a book that was published in all the way back in 1984 by a guy named Konstantin Velikin. And he went through and he asked like all these researchers, these atherosclerotic researchers, what causes atherosclerosis or what's the mechanism, whatever. And he got 59 different answers. They were all completely different. And that was back in 1984. So that was a long time ago. But even back then, like from the get-go, like when we first started talking about atherosclerosis in the 1950s, when Eisenhower had a heart attack, like we didn't know what it was. And people, sometimes they associated it with toxins. Sometimes it was cholesterol. Sometimes it was fibrinogen. It was just all this stuff. It was all over the place. And so, I mean, if you study the history of the cholesterol theory, it was never backed by any sound science whatsoever. So just studying that should make you understand or have some question about the theory in general. But the real testament that it's not cholesterol is that, I mean, there's plenty of evidence, the research against the theory. But the true testament is that we've been treating cholesterol, measuring cholesterol in the blood and treating it aggressively with statin drugs and other cholesterol lowering, strategies. And heart disease continues to be the number one killer in the world. Coronary heart disease is still the number one disease in the world. So it's obviously not working. There must be something else. We're not getting the whole picture. And so, then there's the work. Dave Feldman just released his pretty much most extensive study to date on this, showing that high elevation of LDL or lipids in the blood is not associated or correlated with any amount of plaque burden in the arteries. But there are still people that argue against that. But it's a very myopic view to think that one biomolecule in the body is responsible for a whole disease process. It's very short-sighted, very myopic, especially in a complex biological ecosystem that is the human body. So I started looking at this, and obviously I'm reading a ton of books and looking at a lot of articles and wanting to prevent it from happening again to me. Essentially I came across exactly what my body told me. A random clot formed in my body and caused a heart attack. And it turns out that's exactly what atherosclerosis is. It's clotting tissue. A clot can happen acutely, that's large enough, like in my case, to block a whole artery. Or it can happen chronically, low-grade chronically, that it can kind of accumulate on the lining of the artery. And so why would the body do that? Well, clotting is a normal thing that's supposed to happen. Like if you cut your skin, clotting tissue forms to stop the bleeding, to stop damage so your body can repair it. And if damage happens excessively to the lining of the artery, which there are many things that can cause damage, toxin exposures, acute psychological stress, being insulin resistant, lots of different things can do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Then we get this acute damage. And that when that damage happens, if it's so much that the body can't repair it, it has to do something. So just like it, forms a scab while your tissue heals, clotting tissue forms on the lining of the artery. And if that continues to happen, the inflammation and the damage continues to happen, then the clotting tissue builds up and builds up and builds up. And when you analyze atherosclerosis in people, it's like 87% clotting tissue, according to some studies. So there's very little cholesterol present. There is some there, but it's just like because it was there when the clot formed, it got caught up in the clot kind of thing. So that's what it is. And we all know that a stroke and a heart attack, that's a clot. It's a clot that happens. How the clot happens, I think, is very different than what mainstream thinks. But that's what it is. It's clotting tissue. So then we have to ask ourselves, what causes clotting in the arteries? That's the important thing we got to know. And, I already knew about structured water from previous, research and reading that I'd done. But when I came into the context of structured water and sunlight and circadian rhythm and things like that, it became more clear. So back in 1856, Rudolf Virchow was a very notable scientist, and he came up with what has become known as Virchow's triad, which are the three things that cause clotting in arteries, in veins, but more commonly in arteries. And they are when the lining of the artery is damaged, becomes damaged, which we talk about, when there's poor or stagnant blood flow, or interrupted blood flow, things like that. Just like in my leg, when that was interrupted, and it kind of created this stagnant blood flow area before it got moving again, and that created clotting. Or when elements of blood are sticking together too much, things are too sticky in the blood. And so if we look at structured water in the vascular system, it helps us explain why that may be happening, right? So I'm sure your audience is somewhat familiar with structured water, but structured water is...
I haven't touched that much on structured water on the podcast yet, so please feel free to go in with all this depth. And I'm over here smiling at like all these causes, because to me, knowing what I do know about structured water and grounding and redox, it's just like, oh, it's exciting. Okay.
In that, through that lens, you're just like, oh, well, that makes sense, right?
Yeah. So go on with the structured water. I'm sorry.
So water is a very unique liquid in the universe. We're on a water planet, and we're all told we're made of a very large percentage water. But it's not just this, benign solute that biochemical reactions happen in. It's very active in our physiology, and I would say it's the driver of our physiology. And so water can exist, as we know, in a liquid, solid, and gas state. But it can also exist in what's been called a fourth phase of water, or structured water, or exclusion zone water, or bound water. It has lots of different names because many scientists have kind of come across it at different times and not knowing what to call it, so they call it things differently. But basically what happens is that water can hold energy. And when it does, and it gets next to a hydrophilic surface, a water-loving surface, which all biological surfaces are water-loving, it can actually structure itself. And so that means become more like a gel. So it's not solid, not liquid. It's kind of like the consistency of Jell-O or raw egg white, this kind of gelatinous thing. And this happens next to any biological surface, including the lining of the vascular system, including the lining of the artery. And they've shown this happens in the lab of Dr. Gerald Pollack at University of Washington. They've shown this happens in animals' arteries. So we know that it's there. And so it has there's some properties of structured water that are unique and interesting, and we need to learn about them to understand how this helps us prevent heart disease. One is that it's called exclusion zone water for a reason. That's one of its nicknames for a reason, because of the way that it forms. It basically forms an almost impenetrable barrier. So nothing can really penetrate it except very small hydrated ions of minerals. So anything potassium or smaller can penetrate it. But that means that anything in the middle of the artery cannot get through it. And so it forms this protective layer on the lining of the artery. So that's Virchow's triad number one. It protects the lining of the artery. It helps prevent damage, right? Virchow's triad number two is keep blood moving. And so if we look at what structured water does, because when structured water forms, like water is like oxygen and two hydrogens. And when it forms, one of the hydrogens is cleaved off, and the other oxygen and hydrogen that are left team up with other oxygens and hydrogens, and they make this kind of lattice-like structure that kind of lines up on that hydrophilic surface, and it creates this zone. So because the oxygen is bigger and more negative, this zone is very electronegatively charged. And then the hydrogens that have been cleaved off, they're positively charged, so that creates a positively charged area next to it. So we have a negative and a positive area next to each other, and that's a battery. And we know that because you have a battery, it has a positive and negative end. You have to line them up to create that charge or to gain the charge from it. And they've actually shown that you can take electrodes and put into the negative and positive side of structured water and power a light bulb. So it creates energy. It does work. And they've shown that if you put a tube made of a hydrophilic solution into a tub of water, and you put infrared light on it, which charges and creates structured water, then flow happens through the tube with no pump needed. It just starts to happen because in this case, in a tube, the energy created by structured water formation creates blood flow or flow of fluid. And in the lining of the artery, it does that. And I actually have a video of a chick embryo where they stop the heart of the chick and the blood continued to move. And they put infrared light on it and it can still continue to move. So this is how blood moves. So that's Virchow's triad number two, keep blood moving, right? Number three is elements of blood sticking together. So if we look at what structured water also forms on the elements of blood, because those are biological surfaces too. So we're talking about red blood cells, lipoproteins, any other protein in the blood. They're all biological surfaces, and structured water forms on them and forms what's called a zeta potential, which is just a negative charge surrounding these things. And that negative charge, like things that are charged similarly, they're not attracted to each other. So they kind of repel each other, right? And so if all the elements of blood have this zeta potential, then they stay separated and not clumped together. And that's Virchow's triad number 3, elements of blood not clumping together. So if you look at that from that perspective, then if clotting tissue is what's causing atherosclerosis, heart attacks, strokes, this kind of pathologic clotting, and if structured water formation is preventing those things, then a deficiency in things that create structured water is likely what's driving heart disease, right? And if you look at what that is, the main thing that structured water is infrared light, and our main source of infrared light is the sun. So you can kind of correlate our move indoors, away from the sun, away from the earth, under artificial light, directly to our growing epidemic of heart disease. And you can also correlate it to with processed food and things like that, which breaking your metabolism, which you could argue is also all about light. But it's that correlation. It's that move away from being outside that is correlated directly with heart disease. And in one experiment, I reversed heart disease, or I reversed vascular disease using those things because my diet stayed the same. That was irrelevant. It was the change in light environment and circadian rhythm, which allowed for healing, that caused that. And so when you think about it that way, it makes total sense.
That's amazing. I'm sorry, it is pouring here. So if you hear that noise, that's what it is. But can you walk us through your not protocol, but like the steps you did to heal? And once again, highlighting why those things are helpful for your healing, like grounding, like why that's helpful, the sunlight piece again, and just, going
yeah.
into
So
that.
in the context of that stuff, what I just told you, so what I did, I started getting more sunlight. I kind of built up my solar callus because I'm a white dude, and I would burn if I just went out there. But yeah, so I kind of got my body used to the sun, but setting my circadian rhythm helped with that too, because I was telling my body when the sun was less intense, when it was more intense, so it was ready for that more intense sun. And I started getting sunlight throughout the seasons, so it was telling it when more intense sun would be coming in the summer. So now I can stay out for an hour and a half or so and not burn, which is impressive for Irish skin. But yeah, so started doing that a lot. And I got my infrared sauna, and I was using my sauna, and I still use my sauna maybe 4 to 6 times a week. Well, back then it was probably closer to 6 to 7 times a week, like every day, for about 20 minutes. But now it's like 4 or 6 times a week for 20 minutes. And then I was doing lots of grounding as much as I could. I would be outside with my feet on the earth. And then more recently, so not even while the healing was happening, I didn't even have grounding sheets and grounding mats and things back then. I was just doing as much outside grounding as I could. And then, yeah, so then I did take the 2 supplements that I think were helpful in that state. The serapeptase is known for breaking up fibrotic clotting tissue. So I did that. And I also took taurine and L-arginine, which are amino acids that we get from animal foods, that were known to increase the health of endothelia. So did those things, and then I built structured water in these other ways. So that's how you kind of build the structured water. But I also started doing things that have been shown to break down structured water, or avoiding things that have been shown to break down structured water. And those things are, I was always avoiding toxins. So, but glyphosate specifically, heavy metals, anything that acts like this oxidative stress or creates oxidative stress in the body is going to break down structured water. So avoiding those things, which is why all those things, heavy metals, air pollution, herbicides, pesticides, are all associated with higher rates of heart disease, because they are looking for an electron, and structured water is a great place to steal an electron from. And so they kind of break it down. But also wireless signals have been shown to break down structured water. So Wi-Fi router, I think, reduced it 15 to 20% in Dr. Pollock's lab. So being conscious about that environment, I was becoming more conscious about that, because I knew like the harms of it and everything, but now I was getting really into it, and really protecting myself against it. So those types of things. And then the circadian rhythm piece, the reason that that is important, like syncing your body up to the day-night cycle, is because, which I was terrible at doing. Like I even mentioned in my first book, like that blue light is bad, and I knew that it was bad for the eyes and that it was bad for the skin and things like that. But the circadian rhythm piece I hadn't, put together fully, because I also knew about that, but I hadn't really pieced it together. But that is essential for healing. And so if I'm trying to heal heart tissue, because heart cells don't divide, they don't replicate and create new cells. So your only chance at getting them to heal is mitophagy. So that is breaking down of old mitochondria and bringing new healthy ones so that those heart cells that have been damaged can heal. And that's stimulated by melatonin production. And melatonin production is stimulated by blocking blue light after sunset and making serotonin early in the morning or mid-morning, I guess, when UVA is higher.
Infrared.
So,
and infrared, right?
And infrared, yeah. So like we need all that stuff to happen early in the day so that when we block blue light later, we make more melatonin. And if that doesn't happen, then when you sleep, I call it, you're not cleaning house at night. So basically it's like you never took the garbage out or cleaned your house. Eventually it's unlivable, right? You can't do that. And so if you never do that, then your cells get backed up. You start functioning on old senescent cells. You have toxic buildup. And so you need that optimized circadian rhythm, that light signaling, not only to optimize your metabolism, but also to optimize that cleaning house at night. So the mitophagy, autophagy, gut renewal, gut repair, arterial lining repair, the lymphatic drainage, everything that's supposed to happen. And so start doing that. Now you're removing the things that create the disease, and you're building the structured water that protects you from disease. And then you're also doing the things that help heal you from the disease that's already happened. And so all that stuff combined, I think, is what allowed me to fix that artery and fix my heart, because my heart is normal now. It's returned to normal. So the damage is there's no loss of conduction of signal, and ejection fraction is normal. I'm living pretty much normally now.
That's amazing. And I love that everything that you just mentioned that you're doing for your heart are the exact same recommendations I would make for someone with hormonal issues or blood sugar issues. Like, that's the beauty of these practices, is that they're so foundational to how the entire human body works. I don't know if you said this, it did get loud with the rain at one point, so maybe I missed it, but the idea that grounding is helpful because it's helping I think you said that with the blood not sticking together, right?
Right.
So we're getting
so the studies
charge
with grounding show that it increases zeta potential and keeps the elements of blood from sticking together, and it increases blood flow, which we know is created by structured water. So we know that that's the mechanism by which that's happening.
Yeah. And I've heard you say this, I think it was at Hack Your Health last year, that you said that the heart is not a pump. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that? Because that was an interesting concept.
Yeah. So, more astute listeners may be thinking, well, if the blood's moving on its own, then what's the point of the heart? Isn't that what's supposed to be doing the pumping, so to speak? And it turns out there's a very large body of research that suggests that it is not a pressure propulsion pump that forcefully moves blood around the body, and that it can't be. Like, it's impossible for a heart that size to create that much force. And there's studies that look at it and try and analyze it as a pressure propulsion pump. And they say, if we look at it as that, it's about 15 to 20% efficient, which is not very efficient. Like, if I was going to, whether you believe we're designed or evolved, that's not an efficient way to evolve or design something. So we have to ask ourselves, how the blood moves. And we've answered that question, structured water. And also ask yourself what the purpose of the heart is, right? And there's actually, even the early scientists who were first studying the vascular system and the cardiovascular system, they had doubts. They were like, this can't be the way the blood moves. There's some really interesting scientists like Pettigrew and this one guy. His first name is Leon, but I'm not even try his last name. He's Dutch. I'm not sure how to say it, but starts with an M. Montalsopho, I don't know. But anyways, they were studying these things and being like, okay, the blood's moving, the heart doesn't need to be moving. They did early studies where they stopped the heart of dogs and the blood continued to move for 2 hours, all this stuff. And so it was just this big question. And then Dr. Pollock comes along about structured water, finds it in the arteries, and we see, okay, that's how the blood is moving. So what's the purpose of the heart? And I think there are three purposes of the heart that I've come across. One is that it's there to vortex blood. So vortex means just swish it around, kind of like when you like have, you know, two-liter bottles stuck together and you swirl it like this and it creates that tornado in there. That's vortexing. That's swishing it around. And so the reason that it does that is because there are many ways that water can attain energy, and vortexing it or swishing it around in the presence of oxygen is one of them that Dr. Pollock has found in his lab. But there's radiant energy, there's contact with the earth, there's different ways. Electromagnetic fields like of the earth can do it as well. And so the heart, if you look at it, is actually one big band of muscle wrapped up on itself. And so when it contracts, it does this, right? It spirals like a football rather than rotating like a basketball. And so, yeah. And so like, if you think about it as one big band of muscle, then when that heart signal comes down, like the signal for the heart to contract, the muscle contracts in a line. So it goes like that. It contracts inward like this, and it goes like that. And so that's one way that the blood is kind of vortexed, like when the ventricles contract like that. But the other ways is that when it moves
he's spinning
through,
his hand, like kind of making like a spinning motion with his finger.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think of what I thought of when you did that is when I've watched, let's say you watch like a waterfall and like a little small one, what you can see is as water goes over rocks, you can see it kind of make this little swirl at the bottom. So kind of like that little swirling action. Yeah.
Yeah. Or if you just like take your hand on top of the water and then push it down into the water really hard,
Yes.
it'll create that vortex, you know?
Yes.
Or when water flows past a rock, like it'll just vortex on the other side. And so that's the point of this, is that this is what nature does to water. You know, nature, like water is always flowing. It's not stagnant. And when it is, like in a pond or a puddle, it's not the best looking water, right? But when it's moving, when it's flowing in rivers and streams, when it's crashing on the beach, when it's tidal currents and things like that, when it's evaporating and precipitating, like water is just always on the move on this planet. And it's supposed to be on the move in us too. And if we create stagnant blood, that's a problem. But the thing is that the reason that it's moving is because water is being energized by nature. In the presence of oxygen, when it's vortexed, it creates coherence or energizes the water so that when it gets next to biological surfaces, it can structure itself. That's how it's supposed to work. Now, if you take that water and you put it through a laminar tube, and you put it through a laminar tube long enough, it starts to lose that energy because it's not being vortexed. So why do we have a heart? So that as the blood's moving through these laminar tubes, occasionally it gets pushed around. Like that's the purpose of the heart, is to move through these things. Like it moves through the valves, and the valves, it like eddies on the other side of the valves. Then the heart contracts and swishes it, and then it moves out of the other valve, and it goes into the lungs, comes back and does the same thing on the other side, and then goes out, right? And so it's really interesting. Like if you look at like a live angiograms of a heart contracting, like you would expect that if a heart was forcefully pumping fluid out, that the aorta, which is the main artery that the blood comes out of, would, like when it's forcefully pumped out of the left ventricle, it would expand, right? Because it would, like if I had a curled up hose and I forcefully turn the water on, it would like extend the hose out, it would come unraveled, right? And that's not what we see. What we see on angiograms, we see it go like this. It kind of squinches up and becomes more bent, the aorta, which means it's sucking blood out, which means when that valve opens, the contraction vortexes it just to create some energy, but the mechanisms of attraction in the blood elements are pulling the blood out of the ventricle just as much as that contraction is pushing it. So there is a little bit of pumping that's done by the heart, but it's no more than enough to get the blood through the ventricles and the atria of the heart itself. And that's structuring it. So that's the first purpose of the heart, is to structure the water. So I guess you could argue that in some way the heart is responsible for the movement of blood, just not in the forceful pumping way that we think of. It's by the structuring water, energizing water, so that when it gets into the periphery, it can move through the blood vessels like it's supposed to.
That was so cool. That is so cool. I have a good feeling around my heart. Like it's just learning about how nature works sometimes, and especially water is just so, it's like so beautiful. It just makes you want to explode. I don't know how to
Well, just
describe
wait
it.
to number 3 then. Your heart's going to feel really good.
I'm so excited.
The second one is that there, if so, like the heart, it actually slows the flow of blood when it's moving really fast. So, like upon exertion, when we're exercising, if the tissue demand is really high for oxygen and nutrients when we're doing that, and so it's so high that if we didn't have a heart there to slow the flow of blood, that all the blood would rush over to the arterial side, and the arterioles get really dilated, the tissues get really dilated, and then the venous side wouldn't have enough pressure to keep it open, and it would collapse. And so there's studies that show very effectively, very elegantly, that during exertion, the heart slows the onslaught of blood flow. Because if that didn't happen, the pressure would not be maintained between the two systems and we would die. They show this in endurance athletes and and soccer players and things. And so like that, athletes, some endurance athletes have like the enlarged hearts a little bit, like the muscle is really strong. And they think, oh, it's because they're using the heart so much. So the muscle has to be stronger to pump more blood. And that's not the case. They've shown that it's actually bigger because it's better at stopping the flow of blood.
Yeah, like a brake.
Yeah, it's almost like a bigger catcher's mitt,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Wow.
So it's really fascinating. And so it has to be there to stop that onslaught of blood flow during exertion. So that's the second role of the heart. The third is the heart has, because of its mitochondrial density, has the highest electromagnetic field of any organ in the body. Because if you look at what creates an electromagnetic field, it's like when opposite charges are flying past each other. So like if you have like electrical currents flowing, they're going to create an electromagnetic field. And that's exactly what mitochondria are. They're electrons going one way and protons going the other way. And so that creates an electromagnetic field. And if you get a bunch of mitochondria in one spot, or a bunch of electron transport chains in one mitochondria, that creates a field. A bunch of mitochondria in a concentrated spot, that creates a bigger field. And the heart has the highest mitochondrial content of any organ in the body, like 5,000 per cell, like higher than the brain. The eye is also very, very high, but it's a much smaller organ than the heart. So since the heart is bigger and has more mass, it's this big electromagnetic field. And it's the only field that's large enough that it can, quote unquote, touch or sense every cell in the body. So it kind of keeps tabs on everything in the body. So it's measuring, or it's keeping tabs on how well the body is communicating to itself. And this is called coherence. So if you look at the Heart Math Institute and measuring heart coherence, that's what the heart is measuring. So it's picking up on how well the body is communicating. This, like cells are communicating. So, or even organs are communicating. So we're talking about communicating through fascia. We're talking about communicating through electromagnetic fields, like wirelessly. We're talking about communicating through like quantum entanglement, which is how molecules get entangled quantumly and how they can communicate in different areas. And so if this communication is disrupted from scar tissue or other magnetic fields that are interrupting with that outside of it, then we can become incoherent, or we get just damage to tissue, things like that. And the heart picks up on that. And so how coherent or incoherent we are internally, our heart's picking up on that, and then it's communicating that information to the brain neurologically and electromagnetically. And so that is then the brain's then saying, okay, we're either safe or threatened, or we're here coherent or incoherent. It's relaying that to the body, and the body's having the appropriate response. So the heart is there to measure coherence, and it's also there. And part of coherence is also our external environment. So, our circadian rhythm, our electromagnetic field environment, our relationships, our emotional state at the time. Like the heart is the measure of our emotional state, which is why we say, I love you with all my heart, or I gave it all my heart. We don't say, I love you with all my brain, even though we're thinking that, we're not saying that. We're saying our heart, because that's what's measuring it. And so I used to think for a long time that heart rate variability is measuring autonomic balance, like the balance of your nervous system. But it's not. It's measuring coherence. And if we're coherent, that's reflected in autonomic signaling. Or if we're incoherent, that's reflected in autonomic signaling, because the heart is picking up that signal and relaying it to the brain. The brain's responding. But that's the third role of the heart, is to measure our emotional coherent state and relay that to the brain, because the brain is not in control. It's just a processing center. It's like a computer, right? The hardware is just sitting there, doesn't know what to do unless it has information to do it. And the information comes from our environment. So if we want to change the way our brain is signaling to the body, we need to change our environment. And that could be our internal environment, and that could be our external environment. but all those environments are being picked up and signaled by the heart and other senses too, like, touch, taste, sound, whatever, that kind of stuff. And the brain's picking up on that and telling your body how to react in that situation. So it's pretty cool.
That's so cool. Yes, mind blown, heart blown, all the things. Yeah. So, my good friend Molly Eastman calls HRV your joy score sometimes. And, it's all these different factors, but I love that thought that the heart is sensing all of this. And so ways to increase your coherence, I would assume, are things like grounding, getting out in nature, getting sunlight, circadian rhythm,
Yeah.
structuring, having this strong internal water battery
Mm-hmm.
and all those things. So, wow. I
Yeah.
mean, amazing,
Well, think
amazing.
about it like this. So, like coherence, yeah, is all those things. All those things create coherence. And when we're synced up and communicating, then every cell in the body is doing what's best for other cells around it, for the tissue, and every tissue is doing what's best for the system as a whole, right? To create health, to create success,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's kind of like people in a company. If you've got 50 people in a company and there's a lot of competition in the company, there's not good communication within the people in the company, it's a top-down mentality and everybody's kind of out for themselves. If that company experiences a hardship, or an external stressor, it's very likely that they're not going to survive as a company because they're not doing well. They're not working for each other. They don't care about the company as a whole. It's at least it's going to be a very big struggle, right? Whereas if you've got a company of 50 people who are all bonus based on how well the company as a whole does, right? And they all get the same bonus, or they're empowered to do things within the company, then make decisions and make their job easier. And as long as it affects the company as a whole, it's good. You're creating this coherence in the company where everybody's working for each other. You're working as a team. And if that company encounters a stress, it's very likely they will come out positively on the other side and may actually even grow. And so that's how you have to think about coherence. Like, are you incoherent? If that stress happens from outside, like, are you going to handle that okay? Or are you going to, spiral into chronic disease, right? Or, you counter that stress, like, I don't know, a heart attack, some external thing that happens. If you're coherent and you see it as this negative thing you get through, you actually become stronger at the other side because you're coherent. And that coherence allows you to see that and grow from it, right? So that's what coherence is, and it's just measured by the heart. And that's that. So when we take heart rate variability, we're measuring that. So when you take heart rate variability, your score reflects basically how well you can handle life and
Mm-hmm.
adapt to it and return to homeostasis and even get better from that stressful thing.
Love it. So good. So you have a book out that is about all this, right? Can you talk to us about that book? And then you have another one coming out.
That the last one did just come out.
Okay.
So yeah, so I have 3 books. One is The Health Evolution, which came out 2018, and then Understanding the Heart came out I guess about a year after my heart attack. And I go into all the stuff about the heart in that one. Although I could probably make it 50% longer now, I think. So if I ever get a chance to do a second edition, I will. And then
Nice.
my latest book is about chronic pain. It's called Pain Sense. Just came out, I guess, about a month ago.
Congratulations.
Thanks. And so, like, I think collectively, all 3 of the books, they have all of this information in there. I touch on all of those things, because it's gotten
Yeah.
bigger and better as I've gone along, and more ideas, putting more things together, more ways of explaining things. So yeah.
Amazing. So tell us a little bit about the pain
Mhm.
stuff, because that's new for me, learning about pain as it relates to these circadian and quantum practices.
Yeah. So, well, I was inspired to write this book because I was sitting at a conference, a chiropractic conference, and they were talking about the opioid epidemic and how bad it was, and how chiropractic can play a role, and how the main approach is drugs and surgery, and it's not working. Matter of fact, the opioid epidemic is causing more problems than it's fixing, because people are becoming addicted. And so I kind of dove into that a little bit with the context of this quantum biology in the back of my head, So, and it's just really fascinating that, like we have, like if we get like injured, like we cut our skin or something, we feel pain there, right? But the pain is happening in the brain. So like the tissue gets damaged, And then that tissue, that sensory signal gets sent to the spinal cord and into the brain. The brain says, oh, that's damaged. And it sends this signal back to that spot to say, create a pain signal so that you become aware. You're like, oh, I hurt myself. I need to fix that or guard the area, right? So it's a sensory pain signal, right? Now, that's present in even small bacteria. They sense this pain and they're like, ow, and get away from that, right? Then higher evolved animals like vertebrates, we have, all vertebrate animals have an emotional aspect to that. So basically, you get hurt like that and you're like offended by it. You're like, ow, that hurt, and that teaches you to avoid that negative thing in the future, right? And I tell this funny story. We've all had the experience of like somebody who accidentally hurts you, and you clearly understand that it's an accident and they didn't mean to, but you're still kind of mad at them, yeah. Because it's that emotional response that teaches you to avoid the stimulus. That's very evolutionarily advantageous to teach you to avoid this negative thing in the future, right? This thing that caused your body harm. Right. So that's interesting. And then the third aspect of pain is unique to humans, which is fascinating. And it requires a very highly developed prefrontal cortex, which humans have. And that is a cognitive aspect of pain. So this is the ability to wonder about pain, to wonder why it's there. What's it going to mean for my future? That kind of thing. Or see pain happening to someone else and fear that it's going to happen to us. And so there's these very fascinating experiments where in World War II, done by a guy named Henry Beecher. He was an anesthesiologist. And these men were coming off the front lines of the war with very gruesome injuries, clearly should be in a lot of pain. And so he was just asking them, how much pain are you in? Rated on a scale of 1 to 10. Do you want pain medication? Whatever. And he just recorded things. And then years later, when he was back at Harvard, working as an anesthesiologist, he was doing the same thing with people coming out of surgery. And he was asking them how much pain they're in. They inflicted a wound, very controlled wound. And asked them how much pain medication they wanted. And he found that that the amount of pain that was reported and the amount of pain medication they were requesting from the soldiers with very uncontrolled, gruesome injuries often was much less than the people coming out of surgery. And he concluded that it was because of the cognitive aspect of pain. And the people who were coming off the front lines saw this injury as a good thing. I'm alive. I'm leaving war. I'm not going to die, or at least I'm not going to go back there for an extended amount of time. Maybe not ever, depending on how bad my injury is. Right now, later there may have been issues psychologically for those people, but in that moment in time, they were saying this is a good thing. Whereas the people coming out of surgery, they already didn't want to have surgery. They're coming out thinking, how's this going to affect me? Did the surgery go well? All this stuff. How long is this pain going to last? And so cognitively, they're turning on pain. And so there's evidence that shows that if you get an acute injury, the amount of communication between the emotional centers of your brain and your prefrontal cortex, your cognitive ability, dictates whether or not that pain will turn chronic. Because if you develop that pathway while you have the pain, then once it's healed, that keeps turning on that pathway. And so that goes for emotional and physical trauma. So you can train your body that way. And so it's no coincidence that people who have suffered from chronic pain, there's also 50 to 75, somewhere in there, depending on who you read, also have mental illness. Their brain is not functioning properly. It's been wired to have a pain response. There's no physical damage anywhere, but the cognitive areas of their brain are sending signals to the emotional, which are sending signal to the sensory, and that brain is where the pain is created in the body. Wow. So it's crazy. And so the thing is, the reason I started with opioid is because an opioid is only ever going to affect the sensory pain signal. So it's never going to work for chronic pain of a cognitive nature, right? And I actually had a patient come into my office and say, I'm here because I want different solutions. I've been addicted to opioids before. My whole family's addicted to opioids. I'm not anymore. And he's like, and I don't want to go back to that because they don't work. He said, all they do is mess you up enough that you don't feel the pain. So what do? They turn off your cognition. That's how they work. But then as soon as that wears off, it's right back, right? So that's why they're addictive, because it's the only way that you can stop it is to mess up your cognition. That's why alcohol is addictive. It turns off cognition. So we have to find ways to retrain the brain rather than block the pain signal until until you lose cognition, right? And that's the answer to chronic pain in many cases. I mean, it could be a chronic sensory signal that's a different type of thing, which I talk about in the book. But for most people with suffering from chronic pain, we have to rewire the brain. And you'll never believe what rewires the brain.
What?
Circadian rhythm, sunlight, grounding, getting rid of toxic relationships, changing your diet, all these things. Like when you do these things, there's evidence out there that changes the prefrontal cortex signaling to the brain. It's fascinating. And so the issue is not the trauma or the physical injury or thing that happened. It's the rewiring of the brain after that. And it's the inability to rewire it again and fix it because of our modern day environments. That's what's driving and perpetuating chronic pain and why people can't get over it. So we have to change those environments. And if we were in that environment to begin with, it never would have happened. It never would have developed this brain wiring that creates that. So yeah.
Wow, incredible. Like I love it. I'm so excited. I just recommended your second book to like 3 people. I have an uncle who is about to potentially go under the knife for heart surgery, and I'm ready to call him up and have a consultation with him. So what would you recommend for someone who maybe is like post-op heart surgery?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know. It depends on which heart surgery it was.
Okay.
But
I mean, maybe not the acute things, but just in general things we might want to look at
to increase healing, right? And to recover after that,
Yeah.
Well, so let's say like, a common surgery that people have, is open heart surgery to do a bypass or something like that. And people should know.
Yeah.
And I've looked a lot and I've yet to find a study that shows that elective stent placements, like where they go in, they do an angiogram, they say, oh, you've got a 50% narrowing, we're going to place a stent there to open it up. Not stents to place in an emergency like mine, that's can be life-saving depending on the timing of that. But these are elective stent placements or bypass surgeries. They looked at the long-term outcomes of people who have these things, and there's no difference whether you had the procedure or not. It does not prevent heart attacks. The rate of having heart attacks is exactly the same. And it's because the stenosis does not cause heart attacks. And there's a very fascinating paper called The Myth of the Vulnerable Plaque, written in 2015, published in 2015, that goes into this. And its conclusions are basically that plaque ruptures in a stenosis does happen, but it rarely causes heart attacks. Their number is 0.06% of the time. So having these procedures doesn't prevent heart attacks. And in that paper, they also say we should be more focused on thrombotic clotting factors, which is what we talked about, right? It's clotting that causes this. So in those people that may have had those things done, it's like, okay, well, you can't go back and undo it, right? So all you can do is move forward. And so some people would argue that, yes, the difference between the two groups that had the surgery or didn't is the same because the people got the wrong advice afterwards. And that's likely a factor. That's likely true. They are getting the wrong advice. Trust me, I was in the hospital and I know what advice they gave me, and it was wrong, very wrong. But the other part of it is
in terms of dietary advice, like don't have cholesterol, have
right.
Yeah.
It was, low salt, literally the list of foods that I was allowed to eat included fig Newtons, animal crackers, foods with vegetable oils, only lean meats. Like it was worse than I thought, I was told that salt was the devil pretty much. Very, very problematic. So, being in there, very, demoralized, it kind of reinvigorated me a little bit, knowing what I know. I was like, okay, wow. But yeah, so those procedures don't prevent anything. But the real issue is that the stenosis does not cause the problem, right? Because if anytime we get a more than 60, 70% narrowing, the research of Giorgio Beraldi tells us that 100% of the time, collaterals build around that area. Sometimes they're just big enough or just robust enough to keep us alive, but we can still get kind of chest pain because it's not the best. But the people who are more active, the collaterals are very robust. And there's case studies of people with a 90 to 100% blockage running a marathon because they have very robust collaterals. And so going in there and correcting the lesion with a stent or a bypass isn't going to make a difference because there's already one there created by the body. So what we really need to do is prevent clotting. And so after those procedures, nobody is taught what prevents clotting, which is what we talked about today, those things. And so people go right back into their indoor living, their processed food diets. I mean, they're told to eat a processed food diet, told the sun is bad for them. Nobody's told about grounding, all these different things. And of course, they're still going to have a heart attack, right? Because they didn't fix the things that cause it, which is clotting. It's just, we've gotten it so wrong, and
So wrong.
It's pretty fascinating in how logical it is at the prevention, So
yeah,
in acute situations,
and
cardiovascular,
simple and pretty low cost.
Exactly.
you know?
Yeah. I mean, you can get, more expensive if you get like more indoor, like grounding stuff and infrared sauna stuff, but
Or like a sauna,
but it's all free, like the raw stuff is out there. So like in acute situations, go to the hospital, get taken care of, all that kind of stuff. But like after the fact, get as far away from there as you can and get yourself back into an environment that will actually promote healing.
Wow. So good. This was such great information. I cannot wait to send this to my uncle and give my dad a different protocol. My whole family has a history of heart disease, and they all think it's just inevitable. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing. Like, it's not. It's just, practices like health practices and dietary trends run in families. And so we think that this is just going to be what happens for me. And I just refuse to believe that. Yeah. And I think that you've given us so many great strategies and just the beauty of how our bodies were designed or evolved. It's so incredible, and how we were just so made to be outside, and that is why I'm podcasting from a tent in my backyard with my foot on the ground because it's just, I feel so much better out here. My brain works so much better. I'm in such a better mood. And, I don't feel tired at the end of the day. Like I this poor woman, I had to get a physical at a CVS Minute clinic, and it was like the worst lighting, and like on the wall it's like health, and I'm just like, no, you guys don't know what that is.
An oxymoron right there in front of you.
I know it seriously was. And I asked the poor nurse practitioner, I didn't go crazy with asking her questions. I was just like, oh, the lights in here are pretty rough, huh? And she's like, oh yeah, I'm new. And I was like, do you sleep well at night? And just like the question just blurted out of my mouth, and she's like, oh, I'm pretty exhausted when I leave, but I'm new. She's like, I'm exhausted, like basically like everyone else is or whatever. And I was just like, okay. And I just closed my mouth after that. I didn't want to get into it, but it's like, there's better options out there. There's more we can do. And I just want to thank you again, because I just feel like sometimes when you have certain things in your family history, or even you see something on a scan, things can feel like they're so written in stone, and it could really take away our power, and it takes away our autonomy, and then our ability to critically think. And then we're so afraid. So we follow these recommendations, and it's like, we see the health and the statistics of the average population. And I'm not saying don't do whatever you think is right. But when we're able to be regulated and grounded and coherent, we can also make different choices for ourselves. And these things can work really, really deeply, really quickly too. We can start feeling better right away.
Well, and the important thing to realize here is that, like, specifically heart disease, but even, cancer and skin cancer and things like that, like these are new things. Like in 1900, the rate of coronary artery disease was 0. Right? There was very little, if any. And the field of cardiology was non-existent. There was some, different doctors that like to study the heart and researchers and things, but the American Cardiology Association, or whatever it's called, American Heart Association, didn't exist. Like it was not there. And so something happened, something changed, right? And our lives have changed drastically. We've moved more indoors. We're eating processed food. We're not as active. We're not grounded. All these different things changed. Artificial lighting happened. And so, when you look at, because people will say that, like, oh, it's inevitable, like this is just in my family history. And they'll say things like Western medicine knows the best, like this is what it has to offer. This is the best that it has. Otherwise, it's just like, you can't think of it that way, because it used to not exist. Right. very, very recent history didn't exist. And so you have to
Yeah.
think about what's changed, and that's what's causing it. And if the tools you're given are not effective at making it go back, because it's not that hard to go back that far, at least create that kind of life in our context of our modern world, then you have the wrong tools. You're being given the wrong tools. It's not that that's the best that there is to offer. It's just that they're
Mm,
using the wrong tools, and you have to find different tools. And we've talked
yeah.
about those tools today. And the reason they make sense is because they bring us back more close to that time when, guess what? Heart disease didn't exist.
I love that.
So
Yeah.
it's the most logical way I can put it. You have to
Yeah.
kind of open your mind to that and realize what has happened.
I love that. And the idea that our body heals itself
Mm,
is a really powerful thing to keep in mind and to even believe. And you see, like, I saw this tree that, I know it's a weird analogy, but like I saw this tree that was kind of like all the branches were cut off and like it was just this like stump of a trunk. And I felt so bad for it. And I spring comes, that thing is like shooting out like branches, and it's a full tree. It's weird looking, but it's a full tree. And I just, like, that tree was just so impactful on me because I'm like, this tree is nature, right? It still has its roots in the ground. The sun is still shining on it. It's getting rain. It's getting nutrients from the soil. There's other trees with the mycelium network helping it out.
mm,
And wouldn't you know, this tree is thriving, normal, just weird looking. And it's like, it heals itself. Like, nature is self-healing. It's repairing. And so when we put ourselves in nature, that allows our body to heal. And I think that's the like the simplest way to conceptualize it. And I love that you talked about going back to before this even existed. Like, blood sugar issues weren't a problem for people. We
mm.
were connected to the earth. We were eating seasonal foods. We weren't, at Dunkin' Donuts. And so it's just, yeah, I really appreciate your perspective. And it's been really great chatting with you with our newfound knowledge. It's so exciting.
Yeah. Yep. The body doesn't want to
Yeah.
be sick. You just got to give it the right signals so that it can do what it needs to do.
Beautifully said. Thank you. So where can people find you, your books? I will link everything in the show notes for sure.
Yeah. My website is resourceyourhealth.com. And I have my blog is on there. I don't post on that too much, but my books are on there, recommended products. And I have actually recently started developing courses
Nice.
about the heart and heart disease, and there'll be other things on it eventually as well. So those are linked on there. I'm on social media, Dr. Stephen Hussey, Dr. Stephen Hussey. People can reach out to me there. My books are on Amazon. Yeah.
Nice. Awesome. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.